"Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son asked over Thanksgiving dinner. And that was the moment I realized I had been living inside a lie. I was standing at the stove in my small Ohio kitchen, ladling gravy into a chipped porcelain bowl I've owned for over 30 years, when Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled at me like he'd just handed me the world. The turkey was barely carved, the cranberry sauce still untouched. Outside, the November wind rattled the kitchen window, and for a second I thought maybe I had misheard him. A lake house? I turned slowly, wiping my hands on a faded dish towel. "What lake house, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, almost playful, as if this were some harmless misunderstanding. Daniel's smile faltered. He glanced at Victoria. She was sitting perfectly straight, her blonde hair smooth against her cream sweater, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "The one on Lake Wexford," he said carefully. "I transferred it to you 2 years ago, for your birthday. Don't you remember?" The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had shifted inward a few inches. I live in a 1-bedroom rental with drafty windows and a furnace that coughs all winter long. I measure my groceries down to the dollar. Last month, I waited 3 days to refill my blood pressure prescription because I wanted to be sure my Social Security check had cleared. A lake house would not be something I forgot. I let out a soft laugh. "Daniel, I've never received a lake house." The word sounded foreign even to me. Victoria set her fork down very gently. "Maybe the paperwork was delayed," she offered, her tone smooth, almost rehearsed. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Daniel was already reaching for his phone. "That's impossible. I had my assistant handle everything. The deed, the maintenance transfers. I've been sending $1,500 a month for expenses."
$1,500. Every month. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I kept my posture steady. $1,500 would have covered my rent twice over. It would have fixed the leak under my sink. It would have replaced the bald tires on my 2008 sedan that I pray over every time the roads ice up. "I haven't received anything," I said quietly. The ticking of the old wall clock grew louder. Victoria stood abruptly. "I need to take a quick call," she said, already stepping toward the hallway. Her phone was in her hand, but it hadn't rung. Daniel stared at me as if I were speaking another language. "Mom, that can't be right." I met his eyes, the same hazel eyes he had when he was a little boy building Lego towers on this very kitchen floor. "I would never lie to you," I said. And I meant it. The turkey cooled between us. The air thickened with something none of us wanted to name. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty flicker across my son's face. Not the polished confidence he wore in business magazines, not the calm authority of a man who runs a company with 200 employees. Just a son who suddenly wasn't sure where his money had gone. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there in my modest kitchen, hands folded, and let the silence stretch long enough to become uncomfortable. Because in that silence, a truth was beginning to take shape. And I had the unmistakable feeling that this Thanksgiving dinner was about to change everything I thought I knew about my own family.
After Victoria disappeared into the hallway, Daniel followed her, his voice low and urgent, and I was left alone at the dining table with a turkey that had gone cold and a question that would not stop echoing in my mind. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the faint murmur of their voices behind the closed bedroom door, and I realized something that unsettled me more than the mention of any lake house ever could. For 2 years, my son believed he had been providing for me in ways I never felt. For 2 years, I had been stretching every dollar, cutting coupons from the Sunday paper, turning down the thermostat to 65 degrees at night, layering sweaters instead of turning up the heat. Every first of the month, I sat at my small kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote out my expenses in careful columns. Rent, utilities, car insurance, groceries, prescription medication. I made the numbers fit because I had no other choice. I told myself that Daniel was busy building his company, that he did not need the burden of worrying about his mother. I never asked him for money. I never hinted that things were tight. I was proud of the life I had built after my husband passed away 5 years ago. It was not glamorous, but it was mine. I cleaned offices part-time 3 evenings a week, just enough to cover the extras that Social Security did not. I told my friends at church that I liked staying active. I never told them that some months I chose between replacing worn shoes and refilling a prescription on time. And all that while, according to my son, $1,500 a month had been sent in my name.
The thought made my hands tremble slightly, so I folded them in my lap to steady them. I began replaying small memories I had ignored before. The way Victoria's always insisted on handling holiday plans. The way she volunteered to help Daniel manage paperwork when his schedule grew busy. The way she once casually asked me to confirm my mailing address, saying it was for a Christmas card list, even though she had sent me cards at the same address for 3 years. At the time, I thought nothing of it. She was polished, attentive, organized, the kind of woman who brought artisanal pies to family dinners and remembered everyone's birthdays without checking her phone. But tonight, there had been a flicker in her eyes when Daniel mentioned the monthly transfers. Not fear exactly, not anger. Something more controlled than that. Calculation. I heard footsteps returning down the hallway. Daniel's expression had changed. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that I had not seen since he was a teenager, caught in a lie he did not understand. Victoria followed a step behind him, her face composed again, almost serene. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, sitting back down across from me, "I am going to look into this first thing Monday morning. There has to be an explanation." I nodded. "Of course there does," I replied softly. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I simply reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip. Inside, however, something had shifted. For years, I believed distance was the price of his success. Now I was beginning to wonder if that distance had been constructed deliberately, brick by careful brick, with me standing outside the walls without ever realizing the door had been locked. The house felt unnaturally quiet after they left that night, as if even the walls were waiting for something to break. I stood at the kitchen sink long after their car pulled out of the driveway, my hands submerged in lukewarm water, staring at the dark reflection in the window above it. My small rental looked the same as it always had, the laminate countertops, the slightly crooked cabinet door that never fully closed, the faint hum of the refrigerator working harder than it should. Nothing about this place suggested that somewhere, on the edge of Lake Wexford, there might be a property carrying my name. I dried each dish slowly and stacked them with more care than necessary. Routine steadied me. Precision steadied me. When you live on a fixed income, you learn to respect small things. You notice details. You account for every dollar and every day. I walked into my bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser where I kept important papers: Social Security statements, insurance policies, the copy of my husband's will. Neatly folded, labeled, organized. There was no deed to any lake house, no property tax bill, no homeowner's insurance statement, nothing even close. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to reconstruct the past 2 years. Daniel had called less frequently. Visits had been shorter. Victoria often spoke for both of them, explaining how busy he was, how travel and board meetings kept him away. I had accepted that explanation because it made sense. He had worked hard to build his company from a spare bedroom office into a firm with over 200 employees. Success demands time. That is what I told myself. But now another possibility was pressing against the edges of my thoughts. What if the distance had not been about busyness at all? What if it had been about control? I remembered a Christmas 2 years ago when Daniel insisted on sending gifts directly from online retailers instead of bringing them in person. Victoria had laughed and said shipping was easier. I remembered a birthday card that arrived with no return address, only a typed label. I had assumed it was a modern convenience. Now I wondered who had access to my mailing information, who might have redirected documents without my knowledge. I did not want to jump to conclusions. I have never been a dramatic woman. I raised my son to value honesty and integrity, but I also raised him to trust his wife. And perhaps that trust had created a blind spot neither of us saw forming. I reached for my old laptop on the nightstand and turned it on. The screen flickered to life slowly, the way it always does. I logged into my bank account and scrolled back month by month. There were no deposits even close to $1,500, no unexplained credits, only the modest rhythm of Social Security payments and the small checks from my part-time job. The evidence was not complicated. It was painfully simple.
If money had been sent, it had not reached me. I closed the laptop and sat very still. Anger did not rise in me the way it might have years ago. Instead, there was a cold clarity settling into place. Something had been redirected. Something had been signed. Something had been managed in my name without my consent. And whether it was a clerical mistake or something far more deliberate, I knew one thing with certainty. I was done being the last person to understand what was happening in my own life. I woke before dawn on Friday morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to rest. The sky outside my bedroom window was still a deep gray, the kind that makes the world feel suspended between yesterday and whatever comes next. I made coffee the way I always do, 2 measured tablespoons into the filter, water filled just to the marked line, and I carried the mug to my small kitchen table, where my yellow legal pad was already waiting. For years, that pad has been where I bring my worries. Numbers are honest. They either add up or they do not. I wrote down $1,500 and multiplied it by 24 months. $36,000. I stared at the figure for a long time. $36,000 would have changed the last 2 years of my life in quiet but meaningful ways. I would not have postponed the dental work my dentist recommended. I would not have patched my winter coat at the seam instead of replacing it. I would not have lain awake calculating whether I could afford a modest vacation to visit an old friend in Arizona. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the bitterness settle on my tongue. This was no longer about comfort. It was about truth. At 9 o'clock sharp, when the local branch opened, I drove to my bank. My sedan rattled slightly as I pulled into the parking lot, and I made a mental note to ask about tire rotation prices later. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and printer ink. I approached the counter and asked to speak with a representative about reviewing my account history in detail. The young man who helped me could not have been more than 25. He smiled politely and pulled up my records. I asked him to print every deposit for the past 24 months. He did. I watched the pages slide from the printer, one after another. There were no unexplained credits, no large transfers, no payments that resembled $1,500. The paper in my hands felt heavier than it should have. Is there any way someone could redirect funds without the account holder knowing? I asked carefully. He hesitated, choosing his words. Only if they had access to your personal information and set up transfers to a different account. Personal information. Access. I thanked him and walked back to my car, the printed statements tucked neatly into my purse. As I sat behind the steering wheel, I remembered something else. 2 years ago, Victoria had offered to help me set up online access to my bank account. She said it would make things easier, that I would not have to drive into town for every small question. I had declined politely. I preferred paper statements. But during that visit, she had asked for my full legal name, my date of birth, even the last 4 digits of my social security number to double-check something for Daniel's records. At the time, it felt harmless, helpful even. Now the memory did not sit the same way. I drove home slowly, the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds. I did not feel frantic. I did not feel panicked. I felt focused. If a lake house existed, there would be property records. If money had been sent, there would be a destination. I would not confront anyone yet. I would not accuse without evidence. I would gather facts the way I balanced my checkbook, line by careful line. Because whatever had happened, it had not been an accident, and I intended to understand exactly how my name had been used without my knowledge. By late Friday afternoon, I had done something I had not done in years. I called Mr. Reynolds. He had handled my husband's estate when Thomas passed away, and he was the kind of attorney who still returned phone calls himself instead of handing them to an assistant. His voice sounded the same as I remembered, steady and unhurried. I did not dramatize the situation. I simply laid out the facts. My son believed he had purchased property in my name 2 years ago. He believed he had transferred $1,500 each month for maintenance. I had received neither. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, not the awkward kind, but the thoughtful kind. "Margaret," he said carefully, "property records are public. If a deed was filed in your name, we will find it. And if funds were redirected, there will be a trail." A trail. That word comforted me. Paper leaves trails. Digital transfers leave trails. Even silence leaves trails if you know how to look for them. He suggested we start with the county recorder's office for Lake Wexford. I wrote down the number in neat block letters. After we hung up, I sat at my table for a moment, letting the gravity of what I was doing settle in. I was not a suspicious woman by nature. I had always believed that family operated on trust. But trust without verification is simply hope, and hope does not balance bank statements. I called the county office and provided my full legal name. The clerk typed for a moment. I could hear the faint clicking of her keyboard through the line. "Yes, ma'am," she said finally. "There is a property associated with that name, purchased 23 months ago, Lake Wexford." My heart did not race. It slowed. "Can you tell me the mailing address listed for tax statements?" I asked. There was another pause. "The mailing address is different from the property address," she said. She read it aloud. It was not my address. It was Daniel and Victoria's address in Columbus.
I thanked her and ended the call with steady hands. I did not feel rage. I felt confirmation. If tax statements had been sent to their home, then someone had designated that mailing address intentionally. I opened my laptop again and searched public property records. The deed was there, filed electronically. My name appeared as the owner. Beneath it, a secondary line listed an authorized contact for correspondence, Victoria Whitmore. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Authorized contact. That was how you redirected information without technically transferring ownership. You kept the name that mattered visible, and you controlled everything behind it. The elegance of it almost impressed me. Daniel could honestly say he bought the property for me. He could honestly believe I was receiving support. Meanwhile, all documentation flowed through his wife. I closed the laptop slowly. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was concrete. The monthly transfers, if they existed, could have been routed to an account designated for property expenses, an account I had never seen, an account I had never authorized. I rose from the table and walked to the window, watching the last of the sunlight fade across the quiet street. Children rode bicycles past my building, their laughter light and unaware. Life continued as if nothing had shifted, but inside me, something had crystallized. This was not confusion. It was orchestration. And the most painful part was not the money, or even the house. It was the realization that my son's trust had been leveraged, carefully and patiently, while I was kept politely in the dark. I folded the printed bank statements and placed them in a manila folder. On the tab, I wrote one word in blue ink: evidence. On Saturday morning, I drove to Lake Wexford. I did not tell Daniel. I did not tell Mr. Reynolds. I simply printed the property address, folded it neatly into my purse, and set out just after sunrise. The drive took a little over an hour, long enough for me to watch the flat Ohio fields give way to quiet wooded roads. The lake itself was calm when I arrived, the surface reflecting pale winter light like brushed steel. The neighborhood was tidy, the kind with matching mailboxes and freshly sealed driveways. I found the house easily. It was modest but elegant, painted soft gray with white trim, a wide porch facing the water. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would have felt like to receive such a gift openly, honestly, with keys placed directly in my hands. I parked across the street and remained inside my car, observing. There were no signs of neglect. The lawn had been maintained. The walkway had been recently cleared of leaves. This was not an abandoned property waiting for its owner to visit. This was a house being actively managed. After a few minutes, a black sport utility vehicle pulled into the driveway. Victoria stepped out first, wrapped in a long camel coat. Daniel followed, carrying what looked like a small toolbox. They walked toward the front door with familiarity, not curiosity. Daniel unlocked it without hesitation. I felt something inside me settle into certainty. This was not a surprise getaway for me. This was a second residence for them, carefully disguised behind my name. I did not step out of the car. I did not confront them. I watched long enough to understand that they were not visiting on my behalf. They were visiting for themselves. I drove home slowly, each mile reinforcing what I already knew. The mailing address had been redirected to their primary home. The authorized contact line listed Victoria. The monthly funds, if transferred, likely supported utilities, maintenance, perhaps even furnishings, all under the appearance of generosity. By the time I returned to my small rental, my mind was clear. This was not an impulsive mistake. It required coordination.
It required access to my personal information. It required Daniel's trust and Victoria's management. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my manila folder labeled Evidence. I added a handwritten note detailing the time I arrived at the lake house, the vehicle I observed, the fact that Daniel possessed a key. I wrote in precise, even script. Documentation mattered. Emotion did not. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was controlled but strained. "Mom, I spoke with my financial advisor," he said. "There were transfers every month into an account set up for property expenses. Victoria handled the paperwork. I am trying to sort this out." I listened without interruption. "That sounds like a good place to start," I replied calmly. There was a pause on the line, longer than usual. "Did you ever visit the house?" he asked. I looked around my modest living room, at the worn armchair and the lamp with the cracked base I had glued back together myself. "No," I said gently. "I have never even seen it." That was the moment I heard something shift in his breathing, the first crack in his certainty. I did not accuse his wife. I did not state conclusions. I allowed the facts to exist between us, quiet and undeniable. Because once a person begins to see the pattern on their own, no argument is necessary, and I had no intention of arguing. I intended to let the truth do its work.
Daniel arrived alone on Sunday afternoon. That detail did not escape me. He did not bring Victoria, and he did not suggest we meet at a restaurant or coffee shop. He came to my small rental, parked in the narrow driveway, and stood on my porch with his hands in the pockets of his wool coat, like a man who had finally run out of explanations. I opened the door before he knocked. His eyes looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from reviewing bank statements late into the night. "Mom," he said softly. I stepped aside and let him in. The living room felt even smaller with him inside it, his tailored coat draped over the back of my worn armchair. He sat at my kitchen table while I poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. I did not rush. I did not fill the silence with reassurance. I placed the manila folder labeled Evidence between us and took my seat. "I spoke with the financial advisor again," he began. "The account set up for the property was linked to Victoria's management login. She told me she was consolidating expenses. I never questioned it." I nodded once. "That makes sense," I replied evenly. "You trusted her." He looked at the folder but did not touch it. "Did you go there?" he asked quietly. I met his gaze. "Yes." The word was simple. I did not elaborate until he did. His jaw tightened slightly. "I thought she was arranging maintenance visits," he said. "I did not know she had keys." I slid one printed property record across the table. "Your name is not listed as authorized contact," I said gently. "Hers is." He read the line twice. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. "I feel foolish," he admitted. That was the first honest sentence he had spoken since this began. "You are not foolish," I said. "You are successful, and successful people delegate." I let that settle before continuing. But delegation without oversight is how control shifts. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "She said she was protecting you from paperwork," he murmured. I folded my hands in front of me. "I have balanced my own checkbook for 40 years, I replied calmly. "Paperwork has never frightened me." The weight of that statement hung between us. I did not accuse Victoria of theft. I did not call her deceptive. I simply laid out the structure of what had happened. Funds transferred monthly. A property titled in my name. Correspondence redirected. Access centralized under one person. Daniel finally opened the manila folder and scanned the printed bank statements. His expression shifted as the pattern became undeniable. $36,000, he said under his breath. I did not confirm the number. He had calculated it himself. That mattered more. "I am going to confront her," he said suddenly. I shook my head slightly. "Confrontation without preparation becomes emotion," I answered, "and emotion can cloud facts." He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something else I had not seen in years. Respect. "What would you do?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "I would request a full accounting," I said, "in writing, of every transfer, every expense, every authorization." His shoulders straightened as if a framework had been handed back to him. He was a businessman. He understood documentation. "I should have checked," he whispered.
I reached across the table and rested my hand lightly over his. "You believed you were helping your mother," I said. "That belief is not your shame." But as I withdrew my hand, I added one final truth. The shame belongs to whoever relied on your trust as a shield.
Daniel did not wait long to act. On Monday morning, he sent a formal email to his financial advisor, copying Victoria, requesting a complete accounting of the property account established in my name, every transfer, every withdrawal, every vendor payment. He also requested documentation showing who authorized each transaction. He forwarded the message to me without commentary. I read it twice, noting the shift in his tone. It was no longer casual. It was precise. By late afternoon, Victoria called me directly. Her voice was steady, almost overly calm. "Margaret, I think there has been a misunderstanding," she began. I remained seated at my kitchen table, my hands folded neatly over the manila folder that had started all of this. "I am open to clarity," I replied. She explained that the property account had been used for renovations, furniture, landscaping, and utilities. She said she had wanted the house to be perfect before presenting it to me. She said the monthly transfers were necessary to maintain its value. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked a single question. If it was my house, why was I never given a key? There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. "We were planning a surprise," she answered. I let the silence stretch again. Surprises do not last 24 months. Surprises do not require redirecting tax statements. Surprises do not involve excluding the legal owner from all correspondence. But I did not say any of that. "Then I look forward to reviewing the full accounting," I said gently. That evening, Daniel called. His voice sounded different. Not confused, not defensive, focused. "There were transfers to a secondary account," he said, "an account labeled for property expenses. It is registered under Victoria's sole management access. Some of the withdrawals were for furniture delivered to our primary residence." I closed my eyes briefly, not from shock, but from confirmation. "Have you requested receipts?" I asked. "Yes," he replied, "and a timeline." I could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of a man reorganizing his understanding of his own finances. "She says everything was intended for you," he added quietly. "Intent is easy to claim," I said. "Documentation is harder." There was another silence, heavier this time. "I should have noticed," he repeated. "You trusted your spouse," I answered. "That is not a flaw. But trust does not replace oversight." By Wednesday, the financial advisor provided a preliminary report. Of the $36,000 transferred over 2 years, less than half had been spent directly on the lake property. The rest covered items delivered to Daniel and Victoria's Columbus home, including furnishings, decor, and what were described as hosting expenses. The language was neutral. The implications were not. Daniel came over again that evening. He placed the printed report on my kitchen table and looked at me as if seeing me differently. "She said she was streamlining everything," he murmured. "She said you did not want to deal with details." I met his eyes calmly. "I have never been afraid of details," I said. He nodded slowly. "I have asked her to provide written authorization for every transaction," he continued. "If she cannot, I will reverse what I can and restructure the account." I studied his expression. There was grief there now, not only over money, but over misplaced confidence. "Whatever you decide," I told him, "decide it based on facts. Not pride, not embarrassment. Facts." He exhaled deeply, as if that permission steadied him. I realized then that the truth had already begun to do its work. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like water wearing down stone. And for the first time since this began, I felt no uncertainty at all, only clarity. By the end of that week, the numbers told a story no explanation could soften. Daniel sat across from me once more. The final accounting report spread between us, like a map of misplaced trust. Victoria had provided partial receipts, vague descriptions, and long paragraphs about future plans for family gatherings at the lake. But documentation has a way of separating intention from action. Transfers marked for property upkeep had paid for custom drapes installed in their Columbus living room. Maintenance funds had covered patio furniture delivered to their primary residence. Even the so-called hosting expenses were traced to catered events that never included me. Daniel did not raise his voice when he confronted her. He did not dramatize. He simply requested written authorization for each expense charged under my name. There was none. The following Monday, he met with the financial advisor and restructured the account entirely. The lake property remained titled in my name, but all access and correspondence were redirected exclusively to me. The secondary account under Victoria's management was closed. Funds that could be recovered were transferred back into a new account Daniel established with my direct oversight. When he told me this, he did not sound triumphant. He sounded older. She said she was protecting our investments, he explained quietly. I folded my hands on the table and looked at my son, truly looked at him. Protection does not require secrecy, I replied. The weeks that followed were measured and restrained. There were conversations between Daniel and Victoria that I was not part of. There were decisions about counseling, about trust, about the structure of their marriage. I did not involve myself in those details. That was not my place. What was my place was reclaiming authority over my own life. I drove back to Lake Wexford one clear Saturday morning, this time with a key Daniel handed me personally. I unlocked the front door slowly and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of new wood and unopened rooms. Sunlight filtered through tall windows and settled across polished floors. It was beautiful, quiet, untouched by my memories, because I had never been invited to create any there. I walked through each room at my own pace. The kitchen was larger than mine, with granite counters and stainless steel appliances. The bedrooms faced the water. A small study overlooked the porch. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the stillness. I did not feel anger. I did not feel vindication. I felt clarity. A house can be purchased in someone's name, but belonging cannot be forged through paperwork alone. Later that afternoon, I called a local real estate agent and asked for an evaluation. I did not make the decision immediately, but I wanted options. The value had appreciated slightly over 2 years. If I chose to sell, the proceeds would secure my independence comfortably. If I chose to keep it, it would be because I decided to, not because someone else managed it for me. When Daniel visited that evening, he watched me carefully, as if waiting for judgment. I offered none. I never needed a lake house, I told him calmly. I needed honesty. He nodded, the weight of that truth settling over both of us. Trust, once fractured, does not return in a single conversation. It rebuilds through transparency, through accountability, through steady proof over time. As for me, I returned to my small rental that night with the same worn armchair and the same crooked cabinet door, but something fundamental had changed. My name was no longer a placeholder for someone else's decisions. It was mine again, and this time I intended to guard it carefully.